Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of George Washington, and the focus is first in war. Now in this case, we're not talking about the American Revolutionary War. We're going back a couple of decades to another war on North American soil, this one between the British and the French, that George Washington has a hand in starting. Washington had been interested in a military career from his early youth, mainly because he idolized his older half-brother Lawrence, who was 14 years his senior, and Lawrence had come back heroically after fighting as a captain for the British in what was called the War of Jenkins' Ear. He comes back, he's actually then named adjutant of the Virginia militia, the rank of major, so he's a prominent military man. He's also a plantation owner, a businessman. This is everything George Washington wants to be, and Lawrence is helping to raise his younger brother because their father, Augustine, had died about 10 years before. Well, unfortunately, Lawrence contracts tuberculosis in the early 1750s. There is no cure at the time, and by 1752, he dies. A tragic moment for the young George Washington, who's only 20 years old at the time. But it actually creates some opportunity for Washington as well. First of all, he ultimately inherits most of Lawrence's estate. He also then gets a chance to step into his role as adjutant in the Virginia militia. Robert Dinwiddie is the royal governor of Virginia, and Dinwiddie is concerned that the French are now starting to build forts in the Midwest area near the Great Lakes. And he's concerned for two reasons. Well, number one, he's there to represent the interests of the British, and he's worried about a French incursion. He's also worried about his own pocketbook because he has personal investments in the Ohio Territory for land speculation, and he's worried about the French in this regard as well. So he wants to send a diplomatic mission to go warn the French to get out. And he picks Lawrence Washington's younger brother, George, to go put on that uniform and serve his mission. Well, Washington's really excited. He's happy to get a small band of folks together. They hack their way through the woods on their journey from Virginia off to the Midwest, because of course there are no roads at the time. They get there, they're welcomed by the French, who basically say, no, we're not going anywhere. So Washington has to get back to Virginia to deliver that message. It is a harrowing journey home. First of all, it's freezing cold. It is snowing literally every day except one on their journey back. They find a local Indian guide about halfway along the way, and it turns out the Indian turns the tables on them, gets them into an opening, and takes a shot at them from point-blank range. Now, fortunately, he missed, and Washington and his colleagues are able to escape. They then branch off, and they get to a river that is, again, nearly frozen. Ice chunks are all over the place. They build a makeshift raft. They're going across, and Washington has this long pole that they're using to move forward, and that gets stuck in the mud in the river, and he's flown into this frozen water. His friend has to jump in to save him. He almost dies. This is a harrowing journey for the young officer for the colonial militia. Well, Washington makes it back, and he gives his report to Governor Dinwiddie. Tells him the French aren't leaving, and in fact, he tells another side story from overhearing some French officers talking about not only not leaving, but plans to move forward deeper into what is considered by the British to be their territory. Well, Dinwiddie wants to use this information, so he has Washington write it down, and he publishes a pamphlet, and it's called My Journey to the French, where Washington's name now gets to be out there as a warning that unless the British send more regular troops, the French are going to try to take over some of this British territory. So that's step one in Washington igniting the war between the British and the French. Step two is about to happen because Dinwiddie, while he sends to London for the regulars, isn't willing to wait. He wants Washington to gather some other colonials together and go back to the Midwest and check the French so that they don't come any further. So that's what Washington does. Again, excited to be able to take on this responsibility at such a young age and early in his military days. So they head back to the area which is now called Pittsburgh. It was a fort called Fort Duquesne, which is what the British or the French were building at the time. And Washington and his men are getting close. They stumble upon a French camp of about 30 soldiers and hear different stories about what happened. According to the French, it was a complete ambush that Washington and his men just came in firing. Washington says that's nonsense. We got there, the French ran for their arms, and then we just responded. Needless to say, though, it's a rout. Washington loses just one man. The French have 10 killed, 22 captured, 1 escaped. So Washington is feeling pretty good about himself, and he also has sort of a romantic notion of what just happened in his first battle. He writes his brother John a letter and says, "I heard bullets whistle, and believe me, there was something charming in the sound." But then things weren't so charming for Washington as he finds out this was not a military mission. It was a diplomatic mission of the French, similar to the one that he was on the year before. And now he knows the French are going to be angry at what happened and they're going to come after him. So he decides to make a stand and build a fort. They call it Fort Necessity. It's not much of a fort. And in fact, when the French arrive, there's not much that the British or the colonials can do to really stop them, as the siege guns do their toll, and Washington is faced with either annihilation or surrender. And so he asks for terms of surrender. Now, there's one problem. Nobody in Washington's contingent actually speaks fluent French. He has one member of his team who speaks some French that goes in to negotiate the terms. Now, Washington actually thinks he gets pretty generous terms because he and his men are allowed to leave, but he has to sign an admission that he, in fact, had killed those French officers and men from the diplomatic mission from a few days before. Well, Washington was fine with that, except later he found out that he wasn't admitting to killing those men. He was admitting to assassinating those men, as the interpretation was a little bit different from what his friend had told him. Well, Washington says this is all nonsense. He dismisses it. It was just a misinterpretation. But the French use this as propaganda, and Washington becomes known as Assassin Washington in France. Well, so Washington gets back, and he's actually treated kind of like a hero amongst the colonials just for standing up to the French, even though he was really at a military setback. But he's not getting anywhere with the British military, who don't want to give him the time of day. And so he actually writes a letter of complaint to the new man in charge, Maryland Governor Horatio Sharp, who's now in charge of all the British forces in the colonies. And he tells Sharp, "You make mention of my continuing in the service and retaining my colonel's commission. This idea has filled me with surprise, for if you think me capable of holding a commission that has neither rank nor a monument annexed to it, you must maintain a very contemptible opinion of my weakness, and believe me more empty than the commission itself." Washington has a lot of pride from the early going, and he's not getting his just due when compared to the British officers. So he says, "You know what? I'm done. I'm out of here." He heads back home. Well, he doesn't stay there for long, because within a year, the British do send their forces, and Major General Edward Braddock, who's been in the military for 4 decades, shows up, and he actually gets to know Washington a little bit, and he starts to value some of his input. So he offers Washington an opportunity to go on the mission to go take on the French. Now, Washington won't accept a commission because it's not equivalent to the British officers, but he does volunteer to join Braddock's command as an aide-de-camp. They all get together, they follow Washington, who knows the route to get to Fort Duquesne, and as they get there, it is a slaughter. The British are effectively annihilated by the French and their Indian colleagues. It's guerrilla warfare. The British are unfamiliar with this. It's chaos on the British side. Braddock is mortally wounded. In fact, almost all of the officers are killed or wounded, except one, this guy George Washington. And he actually is the last man standing to try to orchestrate an orderly retreat to save whatever he can from the expedition. So when Washington gets back, he's actually somewhat of a hero again, even though the military itself, or expedition, was a disaster for the British. Washington also realizes he's kind of a lucky guy. He writes a note to his brother John, "I now exist and appear in the land of the living by the miraculous care of Providence that protected me beyond all human expectation. I had 4 bullets through my coat and 2 horses shot under me, and yet escaped unhurt." It's a little pattern now for Washington. Gets into areas of danger, other people lose their lives, he comes out in pretty good shape. Well, again, he's now praised back home. He's given another promotion. He's now a colonel. He's put in charge of the Virginia militia on the frontier as this war goes on and on and on. But it's not very decisive on either side until the British finally get serious and send a much larger contingent of regulars to the colonies to take on the French. By this time, Washington is again kind of sick of the whole British thing because they're just not giving him his due. So he goes along with General John Forbes on this new road that they build. They won't even use Washington's road to go back to fight again. They have to build their own new road through western Pennsylvania. Washington goes along, but this time the French actually give up. They burn the forts and escape to fight another day because they know that they can't take on these 7,000 British regulars. So Washington's there when the British raise their own flag over the burnt-out Fort Duquesne, but at this point, Washington's done with British military. He knows he's not going to get much of a chance to ever be an equal, and so he takes the uniform off and heads back home. Now, these early military years were a really important part of learning for George Washington. He certainly learns some of the military arts. He also learns how to organize. He understands logistics and supply chain. He understands the necessity of discipline. He also learns how to control his own emotions, his own temper a bit. So it's a tremendous learning opportunity for Washington. But again, he's done with the military at this point as far as he's concerned because he doesn't think he's going to get a fair shake. In fact, it's another 17 years before George Washington puts on a uniform again. And at that time, he'll be fighting for his new country against his old country. But that's the story for another day. That's George Washington and First in War from the life of George Washington. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.